Chapter 20 Dawn of a Day. The feast of the solemn commemoration of the Passion, titular feast of the Passionist congregation, was celebrated on Tuesday, February 25th. On the same evening, the annual community retreat commenced at Isola. Exhausted from the combined efforts of fatigue, anxiety, and lack of sleep, Father Norbert retired to his cell on the following night. It was long after the rest of the community had gone to bed, for the priest had at first intended to spend the night in the sick room. Much against his wishes, he had been persuaded to take a night's sleep. For 10 days now, he had been indefatigable in his attention. Night and day, he had been in attendance until he was on the verge of collapse. Others were available to watch during the night, and there seemed to be no immediate danger. There is no need for the priest to stay up, they said. He could be called at once if there was any crisis. Thus reassured, Father Norbert made his decision. One point should have alerted him, but he was so tired that he failed at the time to notice its significance. On other occasions, Gabriel had been anxious for him to take some rest, but on this particular night, as he was taking leave of him, it seemed that Gabriel would have preferred him to remain. But for Father Norbert, there was no sleep that night. Ceaselessly, his thoughts returned to the dying student. He could hear sounds of slight movement from the sick room. Once he thought he heard him cry out. Tossing and turning endlessly, Father Norbert decided it was no use. He got up and tiptoed softly to the patient's room. Gabriel was still awake, and his face lit up with pleasure as he saw his faithful friend return. Sitting down in a chair beside the bed, Father Norbert gave himself up to his thoughts. Gabriel composed himself for sleep, and for a time all was still. The long night wore slowly onwards. Carefully, they watched him as the hours went by on laden feet. As the fever mounted in his blood, Gabriel became delirious. Glimpses and memories of the past flitted before his weary mind. For the dying student, time had lost all meaning. He was in the twilight between time and eternity. Once he thought he heard the sound of the Angelus bell and recited the prayers. Again, he was on benediction and tried to make the sign of the cross. Now he was saying remembered snatches of the divine office, or feverishly answering litanies with a repeated Ora pro nobis, Ora pro nobis. He started the rosary, and then only half-conscious said to his companions, "Why don't you kneel down and say the rosary with us?" To humor him, those in the room knelt around the bed to join in the rosary. With closed eyes, he started to say the Our Father, then suddenly broke off in the middle with a puzzled look. "It's gone now," he said. "I've forgotten the rest of it." Recovering quickly, he opened his eyes and saw the infirmarian gazing anxiously down at him. Gabriel laughed softly to himself. "I was really wandering that time, wasn't I?" It was painful for Father Norbert to see the flame of life flicker so fitfully. He knew that the end could not be long delayed, but he was determined to stay at all costs. He feared, and the fear was justified by the event, that the powers of darkness were gathering for a final desperate assault upon the select soul. What form the attack would take, Father Norbert could not even guess, but that it would come he was quite certain. Despite his physical weakness, his mind was wide awake and alert. He was ready. When Gabriel had a lucid interval and had more or less regained complete consciousness, Father Norbert bent down to ask, "Frater Gabriel, what are you dreaming of now?" "Good things, holy things, thanks be to God," came the reply. Throughout the night he lay there in the cramped and narrow room. The silence was broken only by the quick, shallow breathing of the dying youth, more painful now on account of the congestion that gripped his chest with ever tighter bonds. Restlessly, he tossed from side to side, for even the weight of the thin coverlet was heavy on his wasted frame. His pale forehead was damp with perspiration as the fever boiled within him. His large, expressive eyes, now dulled with pain, were ringed with dark circles that told of sleepless nights. He had lost all taste for food, and nausea gripped him as the infirmarian coaxed him to take a little nourishment. "Take it for love of the Madonna," whispered the infirmarian encouragingly. "Take it out of holy obedience." Gabriel once more made the vain effort to comply. His gratitude for such help as they could give him was simple and childlike. Frater Vincent supported him with a strong arm and gave him a drink of water. Gabriel lay back gratefully upon his pillows and smiled his thanks. "What can I do for you?" he asked. "You who have done so much for me." "Just say a prayer to the Madonna for me," replied the student. Gabriel immediately complied and offered a tender little prayer, asking his heavenly mother to bless and reward his devoted attendant. A little later, the student made a second request. He had long suffered from a painful hernia, a fact which he had concealed from everyone. Hoping to obtain relief, he asked Gabriel to pray for his special intention. Gabriel nodded and prayed for some time in silence. Then he called Frater Vincent to his side. "What you want is not God's will," he said quietly. "That's a cross which God wishes you to bear patiently and to carry until death." At this unexpected reply, Frater Vincent could not hide his astonishment. Then, after a momentary silence, he said resignedly, "Ah well, God's will be done." Despite his suffering, Gabriel's spirit of immolation drove him to make fresh sacrifices. Gone was the last vestige of self-will, burned and purged from his soul in the cruel crucible of pain. He seemed no longer to have any will, any wish of his own, but was as submissive as a babe in arms. The attentive infirmarian was astonished and edified by his childlike simplicity. In quotes, he didn't wish to do anything without first asking permission, he remembered wonderingly, and if I told him to stop saying his prayers, he stopped immediately, even in the middle of a Hail Mary. If he felt sleepy, he asked me if he might have a little nap. When he wished to turn slightly in bed, he asked my permission to do so. Even when he had to cough, he first told me that he wanted to cough, and would it be all right to do so? End quotes. Just once he showed sudden anxiety, or rather betrayed his extreme delicacy of conscience. One of the assistants sought to touch his feet to see if they were already growing cold with the approaching chill of death. Instinctively, Gabriel drew away his foot, exclaiming, "Let it be, don't touch me!" In his extremity, he still had a thought for others. It was well past midnight when Gabriel noticed that Frater Vincent was still in the room. Weakly, he called Father Norbert to send the tired student for some refreshment. "Be good to him now," said Gabriel with a flash of his old playfulness, "and tell him to go and get a glass of good wine, because he really needs something." Father Norbert pointed out mildly that it was late at night and nothing was available, but Gabriel was insistent. To humor him, Father Norbert signed to the student to leave the room for a few minutes. "Although I didn't go for the wine," he rather ruefully admitted afterwards, "because he didn't send me for it." When the student returned on tiptoe a short time later, Gabriel gave him a conspiratorial smile, believing he had taken a little restorative. The incident stratagem had succeeded, and it would have been a pity to disillusion the dying saint. It was the calm before the storm. Suddenly, Gabriel stirred restlessly and said in a loud voice, "Vulnera tua merita mea, thy wounds are my merits." Father Norbert glanced up quickly, but there seemed to be no cause for alarm. The dying youth had often repeated such ejaculations. But when he said the same words a second and a third time in an even louder voice, Father Norbert took action. Coming closer to the bed, he bent down and asked gently, "Frater Gabriel, are you tempted?" "Yes, Father," was the troubled answer. "To presumption or to despair?" "To presumption." Father Norbert thereupon sprinkled the room with holy water and spoke quietly to Gabriel, calming his fears and setting his mind at rest. After some time, the priest asked if the temptation was gone, and Gabriel smiled his happy reply, "Yes, Father, thanks be to God." The respite was only temporary. The crisis, which Father Norbert had been hourly expecting, came with alarming suddenness as the legions of evil launched their final assault. The dying youth started to twist and turn restlessly in a state of agitation. He closed his eyes tightly, and a look of disgust crossed his face. Then he drew back towards the wall as if in sudden fear. Alert as ever, Father Norbert stood close beside him, and in a loud voice, to pierce his semi-conscious state, asked, "What's troubling you now?" In a high-pitched tone, Gabriel answered feverishly, "How do these women get in here? They mustn't come in here. Who let them in? Mother mine, Mamma mia! Chase them away! Make them go away!" Father Norbert again sprinkled holy water around the room and said prayers and ejaculations to Our Blessed Lady. As suddenly as it had commenced, the temptation ceased and the patient became calm. But in a short time it began again. Gabriel showed the same troubled reaction, and this time in his weakness began to weep. "How is that lady able to get in here? They can't come in here. Why did they let her come in? Send her away at once. Mother mine, Mamma mia, chase her away. Chase her away." For the third time, Father Norbert sprinkled the room with holy water and joined his companions in prayer. He remarked that Satan was now making his most desperate assault, and that this would probably be the final temptation. In this surmise, he proved quite correct, and he also had the added assurance that the assault had failed. Sitting down beside the bed and watching his opportunity, Father Norbert leaned over and whispered, "Frater Gabriel, is your conscience calm and peaceful?" "Yes, Father, thanks be to God," he answered as before. Midnight had come and gone long since. It was now Thursday, February 27th. It was not yet dawn, but the majestic outline of Gran Sasso could clearly be seen looming up against the background of the paling stars. Already, the first faint light was just beginning to brighten the morning sky. Soon the bells would call the community to choir for the chanting of prime interest. From time to time, Father Norbert spoke quietly to Gabriel, preparing him for the moment which he felt could not now be long delayed. He assured Gabriel that he would again impart absolution at the very moment when he expired, and urged him to have the intention of receiving it. Gabriel nodded his comprehension, and again all was silence. The light was clearer now, for dawn of day was lighting up the eastern sky, and soon the sun would rise. Suddenly, without warning, Gabriel turned to Father Norbert and said, "Father, you could give me absolution now." Surprised because he had seen no apparent change, the priest looked at him more closely, but all was as before. There seemed no reason for alarm, no immediate danger. "It's not time yet, son," replied Father Norbert. "Take it easy now, and when the time comes, I'll look after it." Gabriel made no comment but spent a few minutes in silent prayer with bowed head. Then he looked up again and pleaded more convincingly, "Father, I've made the act of contrition. Please give me absolution now." At once his confessor complied, as Gabriel joined his hands and bent his head to receive the sacramental pardon for the last time. He then turned to Father Norbert to ask his final permission. With utter simplicity, he asked permission to leave the earth forever. He asked for leave to die. His voice choked with uncontrollable emotion. Father Norbert could not answer but slowly, ever so slowly, bowed his head. As death approached, Gabriel's wasted hands plucked nervously at the coverlet. They asked him anxiously if he had wanted to change his position and lie more comfortably. He replied that he wanted his little picture of the Madonna, which he had held in his hand all through his illness. Apparently, it had slipped down between the blankets at the time of his temptation, for it could not be found. Instead, someone handed him a picture of Christ crucified from his breviary. This was a favorite picture, for he had cut out and pasted below the crucifix a small reproduction of the Mother of Sorrows, his particular devotion. As he recognized the picture, he kissed it tenderly and pressed it to his heart in an access of love. An unbearable tension suddenly gripped the room. There was complete silence, save for the quick, panting breath of the dying saint. The few who were present felt that it was a privileged occasion and did not dare to speak. Only their watchful eyes, dim with tears, betrayed the depth of their emotion. Gabriel now held the picture in both hands, kissed it repeatedly, and again held it to his breast with all his meager strength. Looking up towards heaven, he cried with indescribable tenderness, "Mamma mia, mother mine, make haste, please hurry." Then he was calm again, and commenced to say slowly and with emphatic pauses a verse from the little office of Our Lady, words long familiar to him with constant repetition. Maria Mater Gratiae, Mater Misericordiae, tu nos ab host protege, et mortis hora suscipe. Mother of grace, O Mary blessed, sweet mercy's fount, to thee we fly, shield us from harm and take us hence, to thy dear bosom when we die. Another familiar prayer followed, said slowly, distinctively, tenderly, the prayer that brought him back to childhood's happy, carefree days. Jesus, Mary, and Joseph, I give you my heart and my soul. Jesus, Mary, and Joseph, assist me in my last agony. Jesus, Mary, and Joseph, may I breathe forth my soul in peace with you. He prolonged the word breathe so noticeably that some thought he would be unable to finish the prayer. They were his last words. As he finished them, he closed his eyes and sank back on the pillows. Although he kept the little picture pressed to his heart, his grip relaxed somewhat, and his rate of breathing slowed perceptibly. Father Norbert realized that this was death. Quickly, he directed the bell to be rung to call the community to the room. In a few minutes, all who were not actually saying or serving Mass had crowded through the narrow doorway. They knew not what to expect, but all wished to see the end of a life they deemed that of a saint. His breathing grew slower still. There was no agony, no pain. He seemed like one about to fall asleep after the heavy labor of a long and tiring day. All at once his eyes opened, and a smile of indescribable beauty came to his lips. His gaze was fixed in mid-air on the left-hand side of the room. His countenance became radiant with joy and lit up with an unearthly translucent brightness, as if a brilliant light were suddenly kindled within. For an instant he raised himself a little from the bed, although his hand still clasped the little picture as before. Then he gently sank back and expired. The happy smile was still on his lips, as of one who holds a secret that no one else may know. Was Gabriel in ecstasy when he died? From a careful weighing of the available evidence, there seems to be no doubt that he was. St. Teresa well points out that there is an extraordinary similarity between ecstasy and death. One of the effects of ecstasy is to suspend the life of the senses. The person in ecstasy is no longer conscious of place or time, of injury or pain. During an ecstatic vision at Lourdes, St. Bernadette was seen to hold her finger in the flame of a lighted candle for a prolonged period, but suffered neither pain nor injury. Only when the ecstasy is over does the ecstatic return from the invisible world of the spirit to the visible world of the senses. In Gabriel's case, it seems as if the ecstasy came first and death immediately supervened. For him, there was no return. Truly, he was a transistus or passing rather than death. For in that moment of blissful vision, Mary took him in her arms and transported his soul to paradise. Such too was the careful, guarded opinion of Father Norbert, who said, in quotes, "As far as my knowledge goes, it seems to me that at that moment the servant of God was in ecstasy." Later on, he gave a more detailed explanation. "I have had occasion to see people in ecstasy," he declared, "and it appears to me that Gabriel was in a similar state. There was, however, this difference. His countenance was singularly transformed, as if through every feature a hidden light beamed forth, the like of which I had never seen. It was a tiny ray of the light of glory, barely glimpsed in that infinitesimal fraction of time, when the gates of paradise flew open to admit his glorified soul to an eternity of bliss. It was hard to believe that he was dead. Some wept for sorrow at his passing. One old priest struck his breast and exclaimed out loud, "I have spent so many years in the service of God, yet I am left far behind." But he, in a few years, became a saint, and had such a lovely death. The time was 6:30 on Thursday morning, February 27th, 1862, feast of St. Margaret of Cortona. Gabriel was just 2 days short of his 24th birthday. Of his short life, from the day he had entered the novitiate at Moraval, he had spent 5 years, 5 months, and 17 days in the Passionist congregation. Outside, it was dawn of day. The valley was still in darkness, but the rising sun had already touched the tip of Gran Sasso with rosy fingers, and on the summit the white snow held a gleam of crimson from the reflected clouds. To the rest of the world it was just another day. For Gabriel, it was the supreme day, the eternal day, when there would be light forevermore. He had outsoared the majestic heights of Gran Sasso. Far behind him and far below, he had left this little world of men and things that sometimes seem so important, but that are so futile in the light that beckons from eternity. As he had been born to the sound of bells, so too, the sound of bells he passed away. The solemn stroke, the toll of his passing, beat out and was lost in the heavy brooding silence of Gran Sasso.